Good morning. Welcome everyone to the third instalment of Steer's Election Reflection Series. We're bringing together industry experts for 30-minute conversations on the impact of Labour's agenda across local economies, transport and infrastructure. My name is Josh Stott. I'm a director at Steer Economic Development. We focus on the role economic development can play in catalysing innovation and growth, reducing spatial inequalities and achieving net zero ambitions. So thank you all for joining us today for this conversation about what a Labour government means in terms of economic policy for the country, and in particular for the north of England. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Clare Hayward MBE. Before I introduce Clare properly, I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping. Firstly, please note that you'll be able to find subtitled recordings of this session and all our sessions on our website at steergroup.com. And as we're talking, you'll be able to use the comments section to share your views, but given the condensed nature of the session, we're not going to be responding live, but we will review and feedback on these after the event. So back to Clare. She brings over 30 years global business leadership experience to the table. Most notably for this discussion, she's the chair of NP11, organisation that brings together the 11 Northern Local Enterprise Partnerships. Other CV highlights include her being an independent non-exec director for United Utilities, and she's also a champion advocate, investor and advisor to a portfolio of SME businesses focused on sustainability solutions and female ownership. So a huge welcome to you, Clare. Thanks ever so much for joining us.
That's all right. Good to see you, Josh.
I'm just going to set out 3 points just very briefly, just to kind of contextualise the discussion. Firstly, as we know from the King's Speech manifesto and I guess all of the discussion coming out of government at the moment, the number one priority is around economic growth and kickstarting economic growth. The details of how to go about this are still emerging, but there's been a kind of clear signalling of a more interventionist approach in terms of national industrial strategy, national infrastructure strategy, Great British Railways, Great British Energy, National Wealth Fund, so a kind of package of flagship initiatives. Alongside that, Keir Starmer's also talked about full fat devolution, so a commitment to deeper and wider devolution. The mayors convened in the early days, back in the first few days of the month, at number 10, and all areas have been invited to submit proposals for deeper and further devolution. And then thirdly, in terms of levelling up agenda, the title may have gone from the department, but the imperative for reducing regional inequalities and really driving up investment and productivity outside of London and the South East remains as important as ever. So that just gives a flavour of some of the kind of topics and issues that we're going to be getting into. But I think as a sort of opening gambit, Clare, I just wanted to ask you to share any reflections on government's first month. In terms of, I guess, the tone, the ambition, the sort of enthusiasm, does it feel any different?
I think it feels very different. The sense I'm getting as I'm speaking to businesses across the north is actually people are pretty hopeful that this intent to have a longer term vision, to have some clarity, to put some things in place fairly quickly without a lot of chopping and changing is going to be very welcome. I think there's also a sense that we need clarity around our industrial strategy. We need some clarity around how are we going to encourage inward investment, both foreign direct investment, but also encourage investment domestically. So some of the language that's being used, I think, is welcome. I think there's also a recognition, you mentioned the phrase levelling up. There is a lot of discussion around regional inequalities. That's absolutely the case. What we don't want is lots of slogans. What we want is action and implementation so that we can actually deliver on some of those elements. So obviously we're only a month in. They're pretty quick off the mark. and also put in place a fairly northern focused cabinet. And also my sense is that there was a desire to find the right people for the right jobs. And sometimes going beyond just a political landscape, but thinking quite clearly about what are the skills and capabilities that we need to be able to deliver on the economic growth agenda. So those are some of the positives that I'm hearing from some of the businesses that I'm talking to.
And do you think that can be sustained? Because I guess there's always going to be an initial fanfare with a new government coming in. Do you think it's or what do you think needs to happen in terms of maintaining that momentum around the agenda?
Well, I think there's a few things. I'm definitely getting the impression that they're trying to get all the bad news out pretty quickly, and we've got to make sure that. And I probably would do the similar thing. Actually, let's really understand the landscape, the challenges that we've got in front of us, and what we want to do. I think it's still a need for being really clear about what the UK vision is. We've been really clear about the North, about what it is that we want to deliver for the North of England. And we are going to be working very closely with mayors and our local business leaders and government over the next few months to make sure that we can deliver on that vision. So I think there is that desire to make sure that there's clarity on the direction that we're going in, but also the recognition that the devolution agenda is going to be accelerated. And actually, we're in a really fortunate place across the North in that, we've actually got to the stage where we have a number of mayors already. And that is beginning to be able, you can see the success on that. And we know that to get regional and national growth, you need to invest in our cities and in our regions to enable that to happen. So, in many ways, we've got quite a lot of that platform in place. We need to accelerate that.
Yeah. And should we just delve into a bit more? You talked about the kind of clear messages to government, just in terms of what the priorities are, what the key opportunities are for the North, in terms of helping drive not only northern growth, but also national growth.
Absolutely. So over the last year or so, we've been working really closely with our stakeholders across the North. So that includes our mayors, it includes our universities and the N8. It includes our big and small businesses across the North. It also includes those organisations that are pulling together a number of areas, such as Northwest Net Zero, for example, and the desire to reduce the industrial emissions in Teesside and Humber. So we've been working really closely with a lot of those organisations and have come up with 4 clear priorities. And with devolution sitting underneath that. So around trade and investment, around our net zero agenda, around our transport and connectivity, and then a people in place. So for us, actually really honing in on some of those elements is really where we can start to deliver that growth that we need. And we know that by all the research we've done around the MPIER, so I don't know if anybody's actually read that's listening to us today, but I'd like to encourage everybody to read the MPIER, the Harrington Review. Also, we've got the Manifesto of the North now, or for the North, which is on the website. And that really highlights where we believe that we should focus our energies and make sure that we can deliver. And this is about getting real clarity and focus so that we can make sure that we're moving that economic growth lever as quickly as we possibly can.
Yeah, you mentioned the Harrington Review there in terms of trade and investment and attracting FDI. I think one of the conclusions from that was around presented a sort of disjointed picture and one of competition between areas across the North rather than collaboration. Is that inevitable, or do you think that there is the opportunity to develop a more coherent and joined up offer?
Well, there's definitely a desire to have a much more joined up approach to our trade and investment. But there's a number of different elements that I think we need to take into consideration. So one of them is, let's make sure that we're raising our profile, both globally and domestically. So globally, I think we need to be raising our profile of the UK as a good place to invest. But to do that, we've got to be really clear around our long-term security, stability, creating a business environment that really does attract people to come and talk to the UK, but also to the north of England. Then there is something about making sure we're really clear about our investable propositions across the north. So we'll have our northern investable propositions, but work really, really closely with the regions and at a local level to say, this is what you could do at a northern level, but actually there are opportunities to invest in life sciences or clean energy in these particular areas. So it's really important to make sure that there's a bigger northern picture, as well as a recognition of all the assets that we have and the investable propositions that we have at a local level. But I think the Harrington Review is an interesting one, and one I'd really recommend people to become familiar with, because it talks about that environment, the business environment being attractive, making us attractive. But some of that is about simplicity as much as anything else. We do overly complicate. And I do think we need to make sure that we simplify that process. So if you're sat in any of the global our countries that we're competing and collaborating with, we need to make it as simple as possible for them to be able to, in essence, pick up the phone and invest in the north of England.
Great. And you mentioned that a high proportion of northern MPs on the front bench, which presumably you'd hope is going to be a good thing. I guess from an infrastructure perspective, does that give you confidence? Do you think the government really understand the kind of dire need for investment in transport connectivity across the north?
Well, there's a few things, aren't there, on the transport, and I must admit it's a bit of having travelled to London for 30 years for 2 or 3 days a week. I do know the West Coast Main Line pretty well, but it's not just about that. It's about the east-west connectivity. It is absolutely critical and fundamental to our ability to increase our economic growth and to improve our productivity, if we can deliver on some of our transport plans. I mean, there is the Crewe Manchester high speed bill that's in the King's Speech. However, it doesn't commit to any particular projects. So that is something that I think we need to explore with some urgency. Certainly, I know Greater Manchester are having some of those conversations, as are wider northern leaders. We would still have wanted HS2 as businesses to invest in HS2 and the Northern Powerhouse Rail. That was our desire. That isn't currently in the bill. And the reasons for that is because that's not about speed, which is something that always comes up. That is about capacity. And some people may have seen this at the weekend, that there seems to be an increase of prices we may be expecting across the north of England to actually reduce the number of people going on the train because they've got the capacity. Now, for me, that would get absolutely in the way of economic growth and productivity for the north. So that's something I do think we need to continue to explore. I think things like the buses and actually looking at different models has been demonstrated by the B network in Manchester is really important. But we also need to take into consideration things like the airport and how do we make sure we make the most of Manchester Airport and other airports across the north to really enable some of that productivity and economic growth, who can also play a key part in our sustainability and net zero agenda. But we need to really think about that really closely. And Transport for the North been putting together a really comprehensive strategic transport plan that, again, we are going to be working really closely with government to ensure that we can deliver on that.
Yeah. I mean, hugely challenging kind of fiscal environment, even, yesterday in terms of £20 billion black holes and, these kind of capital projects being cut rather than, added to the pipeline. I guess importance on being able to really advocate and make as strong a case as possible for any investment in the north is more important than ever.
It is, and I think we've got the research and we have the evidence to say, if we invest, we will give you a really good return on your money. And at the end of the day, that's pretty critical and pretty core. I mean, one of the things that I think we really do hope that we will find is some of the elements such as recognising the consequence and the long-term consequences of some of these decisions. And I think in many ways, what we want to move away from is this really short-term thinking. And the other element that I think has been getting in the way of our economic growth in the north is actually just not making a decision. So quite often what we're finding is decision making is really long, and then people are committing but not doing the actual spend. And again, or changing the plan, and therefore you've got a real uncertainty in the economy. So if we can hone in on some of those elements where, you know, we commit, we deliver, and also we make some decision makings, whether it's a yes or a no, sometimes it actually doesn't matter, make a decision, rather than having businesses hanging on to not clear in the landscape that they're having to invest in. So I think that that's pretty important. So yeah, let's keep focused on the consequences of making some of these decisions and thinking about them longer term in terms of how we're actually going to achieve the economic growth that's required for us to be able to have a sustainable, inclusive, healthy economy.
Yeah, and you mentioned the term there, sustainable in terms of growth. Do you think that the ambitions that the partnership have got and local economies have got, is that compatible with the net zero agenda?
Well, I think actually a lot of the growth will come from that net zero agenda. And I think when we look at some of the clusters, so particularly around things like the industrial clusters that we have, so we've got 3 of those where we've really got quite high emitting, but also pretty productive industrial clusters in the north. So we do need to make sure that we're giving them the support. And we've had some pretty good successes in Humber, Teesside and the northwest. And around Cheshire with things like HyNet and some of the investment we've had there. So maintaining and keeping that momentum going is really important. But again, something that comes up, whatever sector you are in, is our capacity, our energy capacity. So putting in place the Great British Energy, I think is going to be really important. So I think Jürgen Meyer's just been announced as leading on that. And, you know, that's a big job, because it doesn't matter whether you're in the water industry, the transport sector, the aviation sector, it doesn't matter which housing sector. Actually, our capacity at grid level is holding us back. So we do need to have a really sensible conversation about our capacity and where and how and when are we going to invest in that. So I think that's actually a bit of a priority for us, and I'm not quite sure that comes up the agenda as quickly as it should. And then the other areas around the whole net zero is actually, let's make sure that we're collaborating, learning from each other, and competing at a global level, not necessarily competing at a really quite relatively small local areas. Because I think sometimes we forget we're putting this competition across, and we're putting a lot of energy and money into competing at local levels, when really I think we should be thinking much bigger than that and actually competing at a global level, not necessarily at a domestic level. So there's a lot of work to be done, but we've also got a lot of really, really impressive technologies in the UK, and I think we need to keep that lead. I don't want to see us stepping back from that lead. You know, I think we need to be a bit more ambitious, a bit bolder.
And presumably ensuring that as part of that transition, you talked about some of the industrial clusters there, and also the kind of existing energy production, where presumably over time, there may be job losses and the need for reskilling and retraining of people working in those industries.
Yeah, and I think that reskilling is, what we won't have is a lack of jobs. We have jobs. And with each one of these big shifts in our industrial clusters and our net zero technologies, we are creating thousands, tens and thousands of new jobs. So that reskilling role, I think, is both a UK-wide role, where we need to understand what our national skills gaps are, and also at a local and regional level. That's a combination, I think, of the education sector working really closely with business, and business also recognising the need to work together, improving the way that the apprenticeship levy works and making sure that we do that really effectively, bringing young people in really early so we can inspire them and think about the opportunities that there are. But also just being really mature and long-term thinking about the fact that actually, if you are going to change your technology within your business, actually you have a responsibility also to just think about how do we help with that reskilling and work with some of the national agencies to enable that to happen. We've got some amazing universities, amazing secondary sector education, and I think we should celebrate that and make sure that we're bringing them into the discussions.
Yeah, and presumably that, I guess that more integrated approach you talked about there, the kind of devolution and further devolution should help that and enable that. Do you think that areas are ready for increased powers and responsibilities? I guess it's one thing asking and banging the drum for devolution, but then there's a reality of delivery and accountability that also plays out.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think some are more ready than others. And I think that there's probably a bit of a mix of capabilities and competence. And I think we need to be really realistic about what do we need to be able to deliver this agenda. I mean, actually, looking at some of the decisions that have been made in the cabinet and key responsibilities, there does seem to be a pretty realistic view. If we're going to ask somebody to be the prisons minister, let's ask somebody who understands how the prisons work. And that's actually, with people like James Timpson coming in, that's actually encouraging. And I think we need to do the same at a local level, is being really realistic about what is the capabilities that we need to be able to deliver, and be very straightforward about that. And then either reskill or recruit from very different industry sectors. Just because you've worked in the private sector does not mean you can't work in the public sector, and vice versa. And I think maybe we need a little bit more of that mix. So you're bringing private sector and business people into the local authorities, into the combined authorities, so that we're actually making sure that we're bringing those capabilities together in a very collaborative approach.
And is there a risk, and particularly relevant given your role in terms of that private sector engagement and the I guess a kind of post-LEP era in terms of that private sector engagement and expertise? Do you think that the right plans are in place so that we don't end up with a deficit on that, and that the private sector and the right caliber and diversity and mix of private sector individuals are really supporting that local growth agenda?
I think we've had, I think the government's brought in about 150 businesses, I think, to work on some of the work. I think it'd be interesting to see how we deal with this industrial strategy and also the regional growth strategies, and who they have sat around the table, making sure that we continue to have the business voice around those tables is really important. If I'm honest, I was disappointed to see that the LEP model shifted. However, that has happened, and we're moving into a very different approach. And I think where you've got the devolution agenda and they're still putting the business voice around the table, I think that is probably very helpful. Again, because everybody brings something quite different to that party, and making sure we're listening to diverse voices and without it becoming a talking shop is really important. But maintaining some pace and maintaining some decision making with the long-term picture in place is going to be really key, and I'd really encourage that to continue to be the case. And I mean, there are some really good examples of where that's working well, but I think there's also places where that may be taking a little bit more of a backward step, and I would encourage that to maintain that collaboration.
Yeah. No, that's, I think, all really good points. What about in terms of the kind of wider private sector engagement, in terms of, we touched on earlier, in terms of being able to kind of secure investment, whether that be, through the UK Infrastructure Bank, British Business Bank, or, more from the private sector in terms of, sovereign wealth funds, institutional investors, etc.
Yeah.
I think the North has secured an awful lot of investment, particularly in the kind of net zero and energy infrastructure over the last couple of years, but is there anything we should be doing, or anything North can be doing more to kind of shift the dial and really to try and help rebalance that level of investment across the country?
Yeah, well, I think there's a few things. So with the intended National Wealth Fund, where they're bringing in the National Infrastructure Bank and also the British Business Bank, working with them together is going to be pretty important, but also making sure that we're, people like DBT and others, and you've got the Green Finance Institute, everybody working really closely, and UKRI are investing. There are some things that I think we need to be really thoughtful about. And some of that is actually application processes. If I think about some of the SMEs that I speak to on a very regular basis, some of which I've invested in myself, we make the application process extraordinarily complicated. And as an entrepreneur, it's very difficult to get that balance right if you're constantly having to fill in applications for funding, as opposed to making that as simple and as straightforward as possible. And then not to make a decision at all and keep people hanging on for 9 months, a year, and then expecting a match fund. All of those things actually make life quite complex, whether you're an SME or whether you're a large business. I think there is something about making that a much simpler and much more efficient process. I think we also need to be really transparent. There's something about transparency and sharing information, and then making a commitment. So I think particularly if you're going for funding, which is government backed, making sure that we're not going to then switch that off, because a business needs to be able to plan for the long term. So again, I'd go back to keeping it simple and focusing on the long term. So in some ways it sounds really simple, but some of this is really getting in the way of us enabling our incredibly innovative and creative businesses to be able to deliver. And the other thing is, I think we still need to have a conversation about our trading partners and how we're going to ensure that we're enabling import and exports. Who I still have conversations with a lot of businesses who are finding the bureaucracy really complex and getting in the way of their ability to deliver. So that's something else I think still needs to be on the agenda.
Yeah, okay. I'm conscious we've only got a couple of minutes left, and just wanted to in terms of, I guess, what you think the priorities are for, or your key asks are of the new government, working with them over the next term. Is there anything, either what you've already talked about or anything we haven't touched on yet, that you think is an absolute priority and that you really want to be putting on Keir Starmer and colleagues' agenda?
So if I stick with our sustainable and inclusive and healthy growth for the North, absolutely, we take each one of those. So I think being quite bold and ambitious around our net zero agenda, I think, is really important, and enabling those creative thoughts and plans that we've got, really honing in on some of our investable propositions. Let's really get behind all of those. Let's raise our profile as the UK at a global level to really make sure that we're setting up the business environment to attract people into the UK. I think on our trade and investment, let's simplify that. Let's make sure that we're making some decisions and attracting money into some of those investment areas. And then transport, which again is a real passion, and I know is, I hope that we have some very sensible conversations around the impact and how do we make sure that getting around the north of England is less costly. It's £363 to get from Macclesfield to London on a standard ticket, and you could do the same journey, same length of time, same distance in the south for £36, just to give you a little bit of an indication. So there's a lot of work to do on the transport, and I'm pleased to say our partners, Transport for the North, are doing a lot of work around that. So yes, those would be my priorities. But I would just like to mention Nature North as well, because they're doing a lot. So let's make sure we have a nature view. So many things.
And those nature-based solutions in terms of the net zero agenda, obviously, so important. And then just finally, the final word, we'll obviously just talk then about in terms of engagement with national government and what the priorities are. But is there any advice you'd give to local areas in terms of them being able to drive kind of local growth agendas locally, and I guess in particular in terms of them developing their local growth strategies? We've got about a minute.
Okay, so focusing on the vision, prioritize, make a decision, improve planning.
Yeah, okay, and I'll just add to that, make sure you've got the pipeline of investable propositions to back it up. It's one thing having the words, and it's another thing the projects and the opportunities. Okay, Claire, that's been a really fascinating discussion. Thank you ever so much for your time, and thank you all to the audience as well for participating. We've got further sessions planned this week and next week. We're going to be turning our attention to the transport side, including sessions on transport policy, on rail, on bus franchising as well. So if you haven't already signed up, then please do visit our website, steer.com. And without further ado, I'll just say thanks again to Claire. Good luck with all the challenges and opportunities you've got in driving forward that Northern ambition. And thanks to you all.
Thank you, Josh.